Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1221, and it is titled Facts You Should Know About Willpower. Written by Leo Markun, M-A-R-K-U-N, Markun. Let's see, is there a copyright date? Nope, no copyright date. Although most of them are written in the 20s and 30s. This one has a preface, and we'll start there. Sweet idleness, the dolce fornine of the Italians, is not for us who live in the temperate zone. It is true that we often wish we did not have to work. We should like nothing better than to have some unsuspected millionaire uncle die in South Africa and leave us a fortune. Yet, if this were actually to happen, it would probably make us unhappy. This would not apply in the case of an heir who possessed some absorbing avocation, who had learned to work at something other than his bread and butter task. Neither would it apply to a person of the vagabond type. But the hobo is, judged by the usual definitions, diseased, insane. The vagabond may be such because circumstances have conspired to deflect him from the normal development of his character. In the eyes of society, nevertheless, this madness is not to be denied. The pretender who seeks to enter a lunatic asylum in order to escape the necessity of working for his living is not so much of a maligner as he himself supposes. The sane man wishes to get things done. He may be dissatisfied with his employment, true, or he usually is, contented with very little. If he can clothe and feed himself, beget and take care of children, secure the comforts and the luxuries which his neighbors expect him to have, he is perfectly self-satisfied. It is well that this should be so. Obviously, not every person can stand out above his fellows as a Napoleon or a Shakespeare or a Socrates. If everyday labor and every office boy became a billionaire, $1 billion would cease to inspire awe. The general level of fulfillment and the general level of desire have both risen. They will rise still more, no doubt. Only a few individuals, however, can within the narrow meaning of the word be successful. Only a few can be leaders of the herd. The rest must, as best they can, adjust themselves to renunciation. This is rank heresy for the preface of the discourse on willpower. But it is well that the reader should understand from the very beginning that I promise to perform no miracles. My object is simply to tell the truth about the human will, so far as I am able to learn it. I may be able to throw out a few hints which will be found of practical use. To attempt more would be presumptuous. Others promise more, I am well aware. There are apostles of the new thought who teach mice to devour cats, who make giants of moral dwarfs. I know my own limitations too well to attempt to compete with them. Great stacks of books have been written about practical psychology. Many of them convey purely medieval notions. Others combine medieval with modern ideas to a disarming and dangerous extent. All too few represent the scientific methods and investigations of the best contemporary psychologists. Let it be conceded that the student of human conduct have not entirely shaken themselves free from theology, that they are still arguing about terms, that to be considerable extent they are fumbling about in the darkness. Yet they are working scientifically and logically in the direction of truth. Therefore, they are to be trusted and respected, whereas the charlatans and self-appointed priests are not. Pardon me. Scientists are not guided by our fears and hopes and ancient superstitions. They do not answer Pilate's, "What is truth?" with glib phrases, but only haltingly and after laborious investigations. The will to learn drives them forward through difficulties of all sorts. Often the intellectual shortcuts are tempting in appearance. Unfortunately, they are likely to lead one astray. The only road to truth is that painfully marked out by science. Let us see if we can follow it. Chapter 1. Facts you should know about willpower. The conception of the will. What is the will? Is it a tangible force? If so, does it arise within or without the body of the man who wills? Some theologians have supposed all human volition to be derived from the divine will. Others have preferred to attribute all evil will to Satan, all good will to Jehovah Adonai. Schopenhauer taught that will is the fundamental essence of things, not alone of men or of living beings, but of inanimate objects as well. The will seemed to him to be a directing force, something like Bergson's vital impulse. The human will, eros, or love of life, he believed, to lie at the root of all evil. He harrowed from the East the idea of nirvana, or salvation, through the conquest of the will to live. The ultimate reality or thing in itself, that is, the will, can be developed into intelligence, Schopenhauer held. Accordingly, the duty of the human being is not to attempt to develop his willpower, but rather to do what he can to destroy it. Moreover, according to the brilliant German philosopher, the only way to acquire peace of mind, to enter into a state of rest, is to renounce the will. As I have suggested in my preface, however, the desire to rest can only be fleeting in the healthy man of the temperate regions. It is easy enough to turn upon Schopenhauer with a inique argument, to show that he himself possessed in very small degree the will to throw off will. Actually, he was a slave to his ambition, which was to be recognized as the father of all modern philosophy. He wrote books for which he received no compensation. He toiled away to prove that the more popular philosophers were stupid, and that he alone deserved the name of a lover of wisdom. The desire to escape from the will to live, which we may designate otherwise as the will to flee from life, cannot be dominant in us permanently. It can, however, rise to such a degree in a moment of depression consequent upon failure as to cause an individual to commit suicide. Or else it may throw a man or woman into the other self, which is insanity. The will to die mercifully arises in many persons, weakened by disease and the lowered energy of old age. This is not a proper place to criticize Schopenhauer's notion of an ultimate energy inherent in all things, even if such a force should be shown to exist. However, there would be no need to call it will. By this term we designate something which takes place in organic matter, perhaps exclusively in human beings. There are still writers who deny that will is characteristic of the organic matter itself. Although they sometimes speak in the name of science, they breathe the spirit of theology. William Hannah Thompson discusses the mighty work of the will in dealing with brain matter, as the potter does with clay, and solemnly assures us that the will is higher than the mind, and hence that its rightful prerogative is to govern and direct the mind, just as it is the prerogative of the mind to govern and direct the body. Thompson's occasional capitalization of will and mind should be sufficient to warn us against his slips into anonism. According to Dr. Hereward Carrington, the will is that which seems more immediately a part of our inner self than almost any other portion of our mental being. We feel that when we actually will a thing, that we thereby set some hidden energy into motion which sets our muscles into action. This will seems to be centered in the forehead, just above the eyes and nose, and to form in part of the central self or ego. He goes on to call the will a force of energy in itself. I wonder why the will seems to Dr. Carrington to be centered just above the eyes and nose. Is it because people sometimes wrinkle their foreheads when they concentrate on a problem? Or is it because we know that the brain plays an important part in the control of the nervous and muscular systems? The ancient man who thought the liver or the kidneys to be the seat of the mind perhaps felt a straining in the loins when they had made a decision and were about to act upon it. They spoke of girding up their loins to prepare for the action. More in accordance with modern scientific psychology are the words of Professor J.A. Layton. There is no special faculty of will. The will is the entire self of the moment, the whole dynamic complex of impulses, sentiments, valuations, and thoughts, an action either to achieve a desired end or to ward off any undesired effect. In brief, the will is the whole self striving to attain goods and to avoid evils. Layton's definition brings out the idea that man, mentally considered, is one. In another place, I have had occasion to point out that memory is not a distinct compartment of the mind, not a separate machine or process, but simply one aspect of thinking and living. Exactly the same thing is true about the will. William James, in his Talks to Teachers, defines will in a broad and in a narrow sense. From one point of view, it is our entire capacity for impulsive and active life, including our instinctive reactions and those forms of behavior that have become automatic and semi-unconscious through frequent repetition. But it serves us little to use the word for such a conception. In the narrower sense, acts of will are such acts only as cannot be inattentively performed. Often willing implies hesitation, then a feeling of resolve, perhaps of effort. All consciousness, including sensation, feeling, strain, tends to discharge in some motor attempt. For Titchener, will is the general name for the sum total of tendencies inherited and acquired that determine our actions. But instead of identifying the will with the motives, perhaps it is better to think of it as something which arises out of the tendencies. We may consider the will as the power of choice and the volition as the exercise of that power. Will and volition are often used as precise synonyms, However, willpower, as employed in this little book, means volition power. Also, let me read that again. Willpower, as employed in this little book, means volition power also, and especially, it's weird phrasing. Of course, it is futile to choose to do a certain thing and then to fail to carry out necessary steps. Mere desire, then, is something to be differentiated from will. Titchener says that desire appears when some particular tendency to action, which has present control of the nervous system, is thwarted by external circumstances, while the goal of action is still regarded as attainable, and that a wish appears when some tendency to action rises to momentary dominance, but is promptly met by inhibiting tendencies, which the goal of action is regarded as unattainable. Wishes are not horses, and beggars do not ride unless they have desires, which are translated into willing and action. Many an American shopgirl has wished that the Prince of Wales would come by, gaze upon her, and fall upon his knees to promise marriage. But according to Titchener's definition, this attitude is not that of desire. The goal of action is not attainable. Let us consider the case of an American millionaire of old family who thinks that his daughter really has an opportunity to win His Royal Highness. He will see at least some of his inhibiting tendencies, but will consider the goal potentially attainable. Then he will do those things which he considers helpful to the end he wills. Not every volition, obviously, leads to successful action. However strong a man's will may be, he cannot do the impossible. The seemingly impossible, nevertheless, is often possible of accomplishment when the proper technique is employed. For many years, the Patent Office of the United States discouraged inventors who were working on heavier-than-air flying machines. It was considered impossible that any machine weighing more than the air it displaced should defy the law of gravitation rising above the earth. But the Wright brothers saw what had been hidden to the government officials. They took advantage of natural forces which enabled them to counteract the pull of gravitation. At the present moment, it is considered impossible to design and build a perpetual motion machine. Still is. The physicists advance good reasons for their belief, yet it is not altogether inconceivable that some ingenious person should actually construct a machine perpetually supplying its own motive power without the assistance of any external action. Recent scientific developments seem to indicate that the medieval alchemists were not attempting the impossible in trying to transmute metals, even if their goal was impossible of attainment by any technique which they actually employed. The alliance of American wealth with European royalty need not remain a wish or a mere desire. Like many accomplishments which have been considered mechanically impossible, it demands a strong volition plus a sound employment of the necessary technique. In the social world, this consists chiefly of tact. To quote Emerson, "What boots it thy virtue? What profit thy parts? While one thing thou lackest, the art of all arts. The only credential is passport to success, opens cast and parlor. Address, man, address." The will sets a man working, but not necessarily in the correct manner. Desire and ambition alone are not sufficient to make a man play the piano like Paderewski. Many have desired to conquer the world. A few have applied themselves vigorously to the task, but no man has entirely succeeded. Mere will fails not only to control the outer environment, but also to bring about a desired action in the willing organism. Thus, if we want to change the beating rate of our heart, we must take certain drugs. Ordinarily, the heart action goes on satisfactorily without any conscious direction, without so much as the necessity of forming a habit. Breathing, too, takes place without any voluntary effort. We can, however, breathe somewhat faster or slower than the usual rate at will. We can plunge underwater and stop breathing for a short period. We can, to a certain small extent, control our glands. Some actresses can weep without artificial assistance. Some call for sad music. Others are dependent upon glycerin. In general, the voluntary skeletal muscles are intimately connected with such senses as hearing and sight, which are affected by stimuli coming from a relative distance. Many actions which we consider voluntary are simply responses. Thus, we hear an alarm clock and we throw off our covers. Perhaps there is no sense of conflict at all. The one idea of rising dominates the organism. In the words of John Laird, the thought of movement leads directly, so far as the consciousness is concerned, to the execution of the movement. Action of this type is known to psychologists as ideomotor, that is, consisting fundamentally of an idea and an action arising out of that idea. The idea of the movement to be performed consists of memory images of the kinesthetic sensations experienced when a similar movement occurred on a former occasion. According to William James, no movement can occur voluntarily which has not first occurred involuntarily. For example, an infant happens to get its finger into its mouth. The finger feels something like the mother's nipple. The babe sucks its finger. The sensation is pleasant. Afterwards, however, the infant seeks to repeat its enjoyment. Its muscles are not very accurately controlled. Perhaps a toe gets into the mouth, and the habit of sucking the toe is also established. But the little child gradually acquires the ability to direct the finger accurately between the lips and as desired. The action is voluntary, even if not volitional. The notion of volitional behavior involves conflict and judgment, as well as voluntary movement. In the case of the infant, which we have been considering, the action is clearly ideomotor. There is a thought of movement. There is no inhibition of any sort, and the movement results without any difficulty. But let us consider the case of a somewhat older child whose habit of sucking his thumb is rather firmly established. Perhaps the thumb sucking is definitely pleasant. Perhaps there is no particular tone of pleasure or pain, yet the child continues to suck his thumb simply because he has done the same thing many times before. Our little boy's mother reads in her favorite monthly that sucking the thumb tends to make the mouth large and the teeth unshapely. Accordingly, she tells her child that he is very naughty and that his daddy never puts his finger into his mouth. This may be sufficient to cause little Johnny to pause before he indulges in his habitual act. If not, his mother may perhaps put some pepper on his thumb. Here then we have an ideomotor movement. Johnny thinks of thumb sucking. He does not deliberate. That is, but the kinesthetic images appear, or the tendency to move certain muscles which will bring his thumb between his lips arises. Very soon after, the thumb is actually in the desired place. But it is quickly withdrawn. Here is an involuntary movement, I think. The peppery thumb is pulled away. Afterwards, out of the new and complex experience, Johnny learns to keep his thumb out of his mouth. Each time that the impulse arises to indulge in a little sucking, he remembers how unpleasant his pepper-covered digit tasted. Accordingly, there is a conflict between the habitual impulse and the new memory. Here are at least the rudiments of volition in the narrow and empathetic sense. It may seem that the will is merely negative, not to put his thumb between his lips. If he were to watch a child in such a position, we might see his thumb go up in the direction of the mouth, then watch him put down his hand, after a strained moment. There is a voluntary act, the pulling away of the thumb and the hand of which it is a part. There has evidently been a decision not to do one thing, but to do another. An act of will can always be considered to involve choice. Sometimes it seems that the question is, shall I or shall I not do this certain thing? Probably it can always be stated as, shall I do X or Y? There are two alternatives, or perhaps there is a possibility of choice among more than two choices of action. The decision not to do X is intimately connected with the decision to carry out Y or Z. Often there is a conflict between two emotions. For example, love impels a man to kiss a woman just as he is about to embrace her. He hears her husband coming up the stairs. Fear drives him back. Or possibly he decides to defy her husband, either to go on with his kissing or to strike a theatrical attitude. Because of the necessary haste involved in making the decision, some authors would deny the existence of a volition in such a case. One thing or the other is done almost automatically or after a decidedly strained choice. And I think we'll stop there for part 1. See you in part 2.